My name is Maren Holloway. I'm 32 years old. On a Tuesday morning in May, my parents hugged me outside the departure doors at McGee Tyson Airport and told me they were driving to Kentucky to help my mother's sick cousin. My father kissed my cheek like he was the kind of man who worried about family. My mother squeezed my hands and said, "You've always been the good daughter, Maren." I smiled because that was what good daughters were trained to do. 20 minutes later, while I was still sitting in my car with my nurse's scrubs wrinkled from a 12-hour shift, my phone buzzed with a credit card alert. Hilton Head Island Resort. Pending charge. $9,740. For a moment, I just stared at it. Not Kentucky. Not a sick cousin. Not some emergency they couldn't handle without me. An ocean view suite. 5 nights. Spa package. Golf reservation. Dinner cruise. Charged to my card. The same card my mother said she only kept for prescriptions. The same card my father promised he would never touch unless the mortgage was late again. The same card I had worked double shifts to pay down while my brother Nolan told everyone I was too intense about money. I didn't call them. I didn't text. I didn't turn the car around and storm through the airport looking for answers. I sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, watching the charge blink on my screen like a second heartbeat, and I finally understood something I should have admitted years earlier. They had not been leaning on me. They had been living on me. So I took a screenshot, then another. Then I opened the glove compartment, pulled out the folder I had started keeping 3 months earlier, and drove straight to Audra Kline's law office. By the time my parents landed for the vacation they had hidden from me, I had already begun taking back every life they had made me pay for. Please subscribe to support the channel. Here's a fun little challenge. I bet you are watching this video while lying down with your legs crossed right now. If I guessed correctly, type 3 in the comments. If not, type 4. Let's see how many viewers I got right. And if you enjoy this story and would like to support our team, please consider buying us a cup of coffee through the link in the description. Your support helps us continue creating more meaningful, emotional, and captivating stories for you. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. All right, enough talking, let's begin the story. The folder on the passenger seat had started as a habit I was ashamed of. 3 months earlier, I began sliding receipts into it the way some people hide letters they are not ready to read. A mortgage confirmation from First Volunteer Bank. A pharmacy bill with my mother's name on it. A roofing invoice my father had called temporary help. A notice from the electric company that I paid before the shut-off date because my mother cried and said she could not sleep in a cold house. At first, I told myself I was only keeping records for taxes. That was a lie. I was keeping records because some part of me already knew love should not require this much documentation. 5 years before that morning at the airport, my father came home from his warehouse job and announced he was done. Boyd Holloway was 58 then, still broad-shouldered, still loud enough to make a room arrange itself around him. He said his knees were bad, his back was worse, and he had earned rest. My mother, Celeste, nodded beside him like the decision had been made by a doctor instead of pride. She worked 3 days a week at a dental clinic reception desk, answering phones in a soft voice people mistook for kindness. She said they would be fine if everyone pulled together for a little while. A little while became the shape of my life. I was 27, newly licensed, working at a rehabilitation center, where most days began, before sunrise and ended with my feet aching so badly. I sat in the shower instead of standing. I made decent money, not rich money, steady money. The kind of money people notice when they need someone responsible enough to keep saying yes. The first bill was small, their gas payment was late, and Mom said she had simply forgotten. Then Dad needed help with truck insurance. Then the mortgage was short because Nolan had borrowed money for an online business course. Whenever I questioned Nolan's expenses, my mother said he was still finding himself, as if I had been born already found. Nobody ever sat me down and asked me to become the emergency plan. They just treated each emergency like proof that I was useful. By the second year, I had a key to their house, a copy of Mom's medication list, the password to their utility account, and a second toothbrush in their bathroom because I was there so often after work. Every bill I paid for them pushed my own life, further back: new tires, dental work, the RN program I kept promising myself I would start next spring. If a pipe leaked, they called me. If Mom's blood pressure spiked, I drove her. If Dad got a warning letter from the bank, he handed it to me unopened and said, "You understand these things better." And every time I looked tired, my mother would touch my face and whisper, "I don't know what we'd do without you." Back then, I thought that was love. I didn't understand yet that sometimes being needed is just another way of being used, and my parents were about to prove it on the one night that was supposed to belong to me. My 31st birthday fell on a Friday, and I remember that because I had worked a double shift the night before. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, the sky was already turning that soft Tennessee blue that makes every house look kinder than it really is. I had stopped at Kroger on the way over and bought my own cake because Mom said she had been too tired to bake. Chocolate with white frosting, my name written in blue icing. The cashier asked if I wanted candles. I said no. Inside, the kitchen smelled like pot roast and furniture polish. Dad was in his recliner, watching the evening news with the volume too high. Mom was fussing with paper plates. Nolan sat at the table scrolling through his phone, wearing a new jacket I had never seen before. Ruth Ann Mercer from next door had dropped by with a card and a small jar of peach preserves. And beside my mother stood Patrice Farnell, a woman she had recently met through church, smiling like she had been invited into a family secret. For one brief second, I thought they had planned something for me. Then my mother clapped her hands softly and said, "Before we cut the cake, your father and I have something exciting to discuss." I looked at the cake still sitting in its plastic dome. Dad muted the television. Nolan finally looked up. Patrice reached into her tote bag and slid a glossy brochure across the table. It was for a used SUV dealership in Maryville. A silver Toyota Highlander had been circled in red ink. Under the brochure was a credit application, with my name already written in pencil. "Nolan's business is starting to pick up," Mom said, beaming at him like he had just passed the bar exam instead of recording motivational videos in the basement. "He needs reliable transportation if he's going to meet clients." Dad cleared his throat. "Your credit is better than ours, Maren. You could put it in your name, just until he gets established." I waited for the joke. There wasn't one. The room went quiet enough for me to hear the refrigerator humming. Finally, I said, "It's my birthday." Nolan laughed under his breath. "Exactly. Do something useful without making it weird." No one corrected him. Mom only reached over and patted my wrist. "Sweetheart, you're blessed with a steady job. Not everyone in this family has had things come so easily." Easily. I had compression marks on my ankles from 12 hours on a hospital floor. I had a cake I bought myself sitting between a loan application and my brother's entitlement. That was the first time I understood that in my family, being responsible did not earn respect. It only made you easier to ask. Ruth Ann was the only one who looked ashamed. Later, when I stepped onto the porch to breathe, she followed me out and placed the jar of preserves in my hands. "Honey," she said quietly, "helping someone stand is one thing. Letting them sit on your back is another." I didn't answer her. I just stood there holding my own birthday gift, listening to my family laugh inside like nothing had happened. For a while after that birthday, I told myself the important thing was that I had not signed anything. That felt like a victory then. A small one, maybe, but still mine. I drove home with Ruth Ann's peach preserves on the passenger seat, and the taste of swallowed words sitting bitter in my mouth. I remember setting the jar on my kitchen counter and staring at it for too long, as if kindness had become something I no longer knew what to do with. But families like mine do not stop asking just because you say no once. They only learn to ask differently. The SUV brochure disappeared, but the pressure did not. My mother stopped mentioning Nolan's transportation and started mentioning my father's stress. My father stopped saying, "Put it in your name," and started saying, "Help us get through the month." Nolan stopped asking directly and began making little comments whenever I came over. Things like, must be nice to have reliable money, or, some of us don't get rewarded for being boring. By winter, my phone had become something I checked with dread. If it rang before 7 in the morning, it was usually Mom. If it rang after 9 at night, it was usually Dad. If it buzzed during my shift, it was Nolan asking for something he called urgent because he had waited too long to handle it himself. A prescription refill, a late fee, a tire, a bank notice, a password reset. Small things, always small enough that refusing made me feel cruel, but frequent enough that saying yes began to hollow out my life. I started giving up pieces of myself so quietly that no one noticed, not even me at first. I skipped a dental appointment because Mom's copay was due. I put off replacing my tires because Dad said the mortgage was short again. I canceled the first information session for the RN Bridge program because Nolan needed help covering a business subscription he swore would pay him back tenfold. Every sacrifice came wrapped in the same sentence from my mother. We wouldn't ask if we had another choice. I believed her longer than I should have. The strange part was that they never looked desperate when I came over. That was what began to bother me. There was always takeout in the trash, new throw pillows on the couch, a streaming service I did not remember them having, another gadget in Nolan's basement room. My father complained about money while ordering specialty coffee pods by the case. My mother said groceries had gotten impossible while showing me a new cardigan she bought because it was on sale. None of it was huge. That was how they got away with it. The betrayal came in amount small enough to excuse. Tessa noticed before I was ready to name it. We were sitting in a diner 2 blocks from the rehab center. One rainy Tuesday, my untouched soup going cold between us because my phone would not stop buzzing. "Your mom?" she asked. I nodded. "Mortgage?" I said no. "Medication?" I shook my head. "Then what?" I looked at the message and felt something inside me sink. "She wants me to call the cable company because their bill went up." Tessa stared at me for a moment. "Maren, that is not an emergency." I laughed because I did not know what else to do. "It is to them." Tessa did not smile. She had the kind of quiet accountants get when numbers start telling a story people are trying not to hear. "Do you know how much you've given them this year?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. I knew the answer in feelings: exhaustion, resentment, shame, but I did not know it in dollars. That was the first thing that scared me. That night, I went home and started searching my bank statements. Not all of them, just the easy ones: mortgage transfers, pharmacy payments, utility drafts, the credit card Mom kept for emergencies. I told myself I was only checking. I told myself good daughters were allowed to understand their own finances. But by midnight, I had 12 browser tabs open, a legal pad full of numbers, and a headache pressing behind my eyes. The total was already higher than I expected, and I had not even counted the cash apps to Nolan. The next morning, my father called while I was brushing my teeth. I let it go to voicemail. That alone felt like a crime. A minute later, his message appeared. "Maren, call me back. Your mother's upset. Don't start acting selfish now." I stood there in my bathroom, toothbrush still in my hand, staring at the word selfish like it belonged to someone else. That was when I took the first receipt from the kitchen drawer, flattened it on the counter, and stopped trusting my memory to carry what paper could prove. I did not know it yet, but those receipts were about to become the first pieces of a number my family would never be able to explain away. 3 months after I started saving receipts, Tessa asked me to come over on a Sunday evening and bring everything I had. Her apartment sat above a small insurance office near Broadway, up a narrow staircase that smelled faintly of dust and rain. She had cleared her kitchen table before I arrived. No flowers, no placemats, no friendly little distractions. Just her laptop, a yellow legal pad, 2 pens, and the calculator she used at the church office. I set the folder down like it was something alive. Tessa did not open it right away. She looked at me first and asked, "Are you sure you want to know?" I almost said no. Not knowing had protected me in a strange way. As long as the damage stayed scattered across months and excuses, I could pretend each payment was separate. One bill, one emergency, one hard week, one more little favor from a daughter who had been trained not to count. But I had already driven there, so I nodded. For the next 2 hours, Tessa sorted my life into columns. Mortgage, utilities, medical, credit card, vehicle, household, Nolan. Every receipt found its place. Every transfer had a date. Every automatic draft told the same story in a different font. At first, she did not say much. That scared me more than if she had reacted. She only circled duplicates and asked quiet questions like, "Was this authorized?" And, "Did they ever repay any of it?" Most of my answers were no. By the time she turned the laptop toward me, the sun had gone down behind the buildings, and the only light in the kitchen came from the screen. The total was $48,600. I stared at it. Not because I did not understand the number, but because I understood it too well. That was more than enough to pay for the RN bridge program I had postponed twice and still leave me with an emergency fund. It was 18 months of my future being quietly redirected into theirs. Tessa folded her hands on the table. "Maren," she said gently, "this is not helping your parents. This is funding a second household." I looked down at the folder, and suddenly every paper inside it felt embarrassing. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because the evidence made my loyalty look foolish. "I thought they needed me," I said. Tessa's face softened, but her voice stayed steady. "I think they learned you would keep paying before they learned how to stop asking." The next morning, I went to work with swollen eyes and told myself to get through the shift. At 10:17, my mother texted, "Pray for us today. Your father and I are flying into Louisville, then driving out to see cousin Leona." She took a bad turn. A second message followed before I could even breathe. "Can you cover the mortgage by Friday? We'll explain when we get back. Love you." I stood in the supply room, surrounded by gloves and antiseptic wipes. Emergency first, request second, love last. For the first time, I did not answer. 2 hours later, during lunch, my phone buzzed with a credit card alert. I expected pharmacy, gas, maybe groceries. Instead, the screen showed Hilton Head Island Resort. Pending charge, $9,740. Beneath it were more holds. A resort deposit, a golf package, a couple's spa reservation, a dinner cruise, all connected to the card ending in 4,418, the one my mother kept in her wallet for emergencies. Not Louisville, not cousin Leona, not a hospital. I used the clinic phone to call the county medical center near where Leona lived, asking about visiting hours for a relative. There was no patient by that name. Then I called the assisted living facility my mother had mentioned once. Leona was fine. She had bingo that afternoon. I hung up and stood there with the receiver in my hand, feeling the last soft place inside me go quiet. For years, I thought I was helping my parents stay afloat. That morning I realized I had been keeping them comfortable enough to lie to me. I took screenshots of every charge. Then I searched my email and found the itinerary Mom had downloaded 2 weeks earlier after borrowing my laptop to print insurance papers. 6 days, ocean view suite, spa, golf, dinner cruise, booked through Patrice Farnell, paid with my card. I forwarded everything to a private email they did not know existed, clocked back in, and finished my shift. Because that was the part my parents had always counted on. No matter what they took, I still showed up. I finished that shift with my phone face down in my locker. That was the only way I could keep my hands steady enough to work. By the time I walked out of the rehab center, the evening air felt heavy and damp, the kind that makes parking lot lights blur at the edges. I sat in my car for nearly 10 minutes before starting the engine. Not because I did not know where to go, but because once I drove there, I would no longer be pretending this was only a family problem. Audra Kline's office was in a converted white house near downtown Knoxville, with a wheelchair ramp out front and hydrangeas growing along the walkway. The sign by the door said, Elder Law, Estate Planning, Family Financial Disputes. I had found her name months earlier, after a patient's daughter mentioned how Audra helped her untangle a bank account her uncle had been abusing. Back then, I saved the number and told myself I would never need it. That afternoon, I walked in carrying a folder, printed screenshots, and the kind of shame that makes you apologize before anyone has accused you. Audra did not make me feel foolish. She listened without interrupting while I explained the mortgage payments, the utility drafts, the card in my mother's wallet, Nolan's expenses, and the Hilton Head charges. I expected her to look shocked. She did not. She only took notes in careful, even handwriting. When I finally stopped talking, she folded her hands on the desk and asked one question. What do you want, Maren? I looked at the papers between us. I don't want revenge, I said. I want my life to stop disappearing into theirs. Something in her face softened, but her voice stayed practical. Then we start by separating love from liability. She went line by line through what I could legally change. The authorized user card could be canceled. Automatic payments could be stopped. Utility accounts could be transferred back to the people living in the house. The vehicle paperwork could be reviewed. The resort charge could be disputed if I had not approved it. Every step sounded small on its own, almost boring. But together, they felt like someone opening windows in a room where I had been holding my breath for years. Audra warned me not to call my parents. Not tonight, she said. Not while you are hurt. Not while they are still enjoying what they hid from you. She slid a yellow notepad across the desk and wrote down a list of immediate actions. Cancel the card. Freeze new charges. Change online passwords. Save voicemails. Do not delete texts. Communicate in writing when possible. People who are using you, she said quietly, will almost always call your boundary a betrayal. That does not make it true. I made the first call from her parking lot. The bank representative asked twice if I was sure I wanted to remove the authorized user and block pending travel-related charges. I looked at the printed itinerary on my lap, at my mother's name beside an ocean view suite she had called an emergency, and said yes. After that, each call became easier. The utility portal, the credit card app, the insurance login. Passwords changed one by one. By sunset, the life my parents had built on my automatic yes had begun to lose power. That night, my mother texted a photo of the ocean. Beautiful view. Wish you were here. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I saved the message, forwarded it to Audra, and set my phone face down on the table. For the first time in my adult life, I did not answer a sentence designed to make me feel guilty. I made tea, sat alone in my quiet kitchen, and let the silence stay silent. 2 days later, that silence would reach them in a hotel lobby. By Thursday afternoon, my parents had been at the resort long enough to believe the lie had worked. My mother had sent 3 more pictures by then. A plate of shrimp with lemon wedges. My father's golf shoes beside a balcony chair. A sunset over water with the caption, God knew we needed rest. I saved each message without answering. That was harder than I expected. Not because I wanted to talk to them, but because silence still felt rude inside a family that had trained me to respond like an appliance. The first call came at 4:18 p.m. I was in Audra's office, sitting beside the window while she reviewed a letter to the credit card company. My phone lit up with Dad's name. Then Mom's. Then Dad's again. I watched the screen until it went dark. Audra glanced at me over her glasses. Let it go to voicemail, she said. So I did. A minute later, the message appeared. Dad's voice was tight, almost breathless. Maren, call me immediately. There is a problem with your card. Your card. Not the card. Not our mistake. Mine. Audra played the voicemail on speaker, and I listened like it belonged to another woman. Behind my father's voice, I could hear lobby music and my mother crying softly. Then a man's polite voice came through in the background. I later learned his name was Conrad Bellamy, the assistant manager. Sir, we've attempted the card on file twice. It's still declining. My father snapped. Then run it again. I closed my eyes. He still thought persistence could replace permission. The next voicemail was from my mother. She sounded smaller, the way she always did when she wanted me to forget she had made choices. Maren, sweetheart, I don't know what happened, but we're standing here embarrassed. Your father is very upset. Please don't do this right now. I stared at the phone. Don't do this. As if I had packed their bags, as if I had booked the spa, as if I had turned a lie into a vacation and handed it my credit limit. 10 minutes later, Nolan called. I almost laughed when I saw his name, not because anything was funny, but because Consequences had apparently learned how to multitask. His voicemail came in loud and furious. Why is there a tow notice on the Highlander? You can't just mess with my transportation, Maren. I have meetings. Audra paused the message and looked at me. Is the vehicle in your name? I nodded. Then it is not his transportation, she said. It is your liability. By 5 o'clock, Patrice Varnell tried a softer door. Her message was honeyed, careful, almost professional. Maren, dear, I believe there's been a misunderstanding with your parents' vacation package. Your mother was under the impression that family arrangements had already been approved. I picked up the phone for the first time that day. Not to call her, but to send one written response Audra helped me draft. There is no misunderstanding. No one had permission to use my card for this trip. Please direct future communication to my attorney. The final call came through Audra's office line. That meant my father had found the number on one of the letters she had sent that morning. Audra answered, put him on speaker, and said, Mr. Holloway, my client is present. He did not greet me. He did not ask if I was hurt. He said, do you have any idea how humiliating this is? Your mother is crying in a hotel lobby because of you. For the first time all week, my voice did not shake. No, Dad. She's crying in a hotel lobby because you took a vacation you couldn't pay for with money that wasn't yours. The silence after that was so complete, I could hear Audra's pen stop moving. Then my father said the sentence I had heard my whole life. After everything we did raising you? I looked at the folder on the desk, at 18 months of receipts, and answered, you raised me. Then you spent the next decade charging me for it. Before we begin, please subscribe to support the channel. And here is a fun little challenge. Check your phone battery right now. If it is above 20%, comment 1. If it is below 20%, comment 2. Let's see which answer wins today. If you enjoy this story and would like to support our team, you can buy us a cup of coffee through the link in the description. Every contribution helps us continue creating more meaningful, emotional, and captivating stories for you. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. Now, let's begin the story. The line went dead after that. Not with an apology, not with my father asking what those receipts meant. Just a hard click, followed by the kind of silence that used to make me panic. This time, I sat still. Audra closed the folder in front of her and said, now we document what happens next. She said it like she already knew the storm would not end in that hotel lobby. She was right. When a family has been balancing its life on one person's obedience, the first no does not create the collapse. It reveals it. By Friday morning, the pieces started falling in places I had not even touched. The mortgage was not 1 month behind like my father had claimed. It was 2 months behind, with a late notice dated before their vacation was ever booked. The gas company had sent a warning letter the week before. My mother's credit card was nearly maxed out, not from medicine or groceries, but from restaurant charges, home decor stores, and little purchases that had been explained to me as necessities. Every document Audra requested made the story uglier, not louder. That was what hurt most. The truth did not need drama. It had dates. Nolan called again before noon, then texted 7 times when I did not answer. At first, he was angry, then sarcastic, then suddenly practical, which somehow made him worse. He wanted to know whether I could, at least, keep the insurance active until he found another arrangement. Another arrangement meant someone else paying for what he used. When Audra reviewed the vehicle paperwork, she found what I had been too tired to notice before. I was not just helping him with the Highlander, I was financially responsible if he missed payments, damaged it, or hurt someone while driving it. My brother had called it his car. On paper, it had always been my risk. Patrice tried to protect herself by pretending she had been misled. She sent Audra a polished email full of soft phrases. Family understanding, assumed consent, long-standing arrangement, good faith booking. Audra read it once and underlined 2 words. Assumed consent. That, she said, is usually what people write when they know they never got permission. The resort opened an internal review. The deposit remained disputed. Patrice's agency requested copies of the messages between her and my mother. For the first time, someone outside our family was asking the question no one inside it ever asked. Did Maren actually agree? By Saturday, Ruth Ann came by with a casserole covered in foil and a look on her face that told me the neighborhood had already heard a version of the story. She stood in my doorway and said, "Your father told Mr. Calhoun you abandoned them in South Carolina." I almost smiled. South Carolina sounded more respectable than Hilton Head Resort lobby. "Do you believe him?" I asked. Ruth Ann stepped inside, set the casserole on my counter, and took off her raincoat. "Honey, I watched you shovel their driveway last January with a fever while your brother smoked in the garage. I know what abandonment looks like. That was not it." Her words did something the bank statements could not. They reached the part of me that still wanted a witness, not to the money, but to the years. Someone had seen the mornings I arrived before work, the pharmacy bags hanging from my wrist, the porch rail I fixed because Dad said he might fall, the groceries I carried in while Nolan sat on the basement steps scrolling his phone. I had spent so long being useful that I forgot usefulness can make a person invisible. Ruth Ann saw me. That almost broke me more than being used. That evening, Audra emailed me a summary of everything we had confirmed so far: mortgage arrears, utility warnings, unauthorized vacation charges, vehicle liability, repeated transfers, pattern of reliance. The phrases looked clean and professional, nothing like the life they described. I printed the document and placed it on my kitchen table. For years, my parents had turned every problem into a family emergency, and every emergency into my responsibility. Now, on paper, it finally looked like what it was. Not love, not duty, not a daughter helping out. A system that only worked as long as I agreed to disappear. By Sunday morning, the anger in my family had learned to dress itself up as concern. My mother left the first voicemail at 7:06. Her voice was thin and trembling, the one she used when she wanted me to feel like a bad daughter before I had even spoken. "Maren, I haven't slept. My blood pressure is up, and your father is beside himself. I don't understand how you can be so cold to your own parents." She paused long enough for me to imagine her wiping tears from her cheeks. "Please call me. Families are not supposed to treat each other this way." 10 minutes later, my father texted, "A decent daughter does not humiliate her parents in public." Then another, "We raised you better than this." Then a third, "You need to fix what you started before people hear the wrong story." I stared at that one for a long time. The wrong story. Not the false story. Not the incomplete story. The wrong one. Even now, what frightened him most was not what he had done. It was who might find out. Nolan chose Facebook because Nolan always needed an audience. He posted a picture of himself leaning against the Highlander from months earlier, sunglasses on, one hand in his pocket. The caption read, "Some people get one steady paycheck and forget who carried them before they could walk." He did not tag me. He did not need to. Within an hour, 2 cousins had sent me screenshots, both with the same nervous question. "Is everything okay?" I typed 3 different answers and deleted all of them. Patrice sent her own message after lunch, polished and poisonous. Maren, your parents only wanted one peaceful week after a very hard year. You may understand when you are older that caring for family sometimes requires grace, not accounting. I read it twice. Grace. That was what people called it when they wanted the person paying the price to stop naming the cost. I forwarded the message to Audra without replying. My hands were steady, but my chest felt tight in a way numbers could not explain. By evening, the silence in my apartment had changed. It no longer felt peaceful. It felt like every unanswered call was pressing against the walls. I put the printed summary from Audra on the kitchen table, then Tessa's spreadsheet beside it. Mortgage, utilities, medical, vehicle. Nolan, $48,600. Tessa came over with takeout I barely touched. She did not tell me what to do. She only pushed the paper closer and said, "Read the number before you read their messages." So I did. I read it until the guilt stopped sounding like my mother's voice and started looking like math. Then I turned my phone over, let the next call ring itself empty, and finally understood that boundaries do not feel strong at first. Sometimes they feel cruel, because everyone who benefited from your weakness is suddenly calling you heartless. By Monday afternoon, my father decided silence meant weakness. He sent one text at 2:13 p.m. Short enough to sound like an order. "Be at the house Sunday at 4. We are settling this as a family." I read it in the hallway outside a patient's room, still holding a cup of water I had been about to deliver. Settling this, as if I had created a misunderstanding instead of uncovered one. As if the solution was for me to sit on their couch and be reminded where I belonged. I showed the message to Audra the next morning. She read it once, then asked, "Do you want to go?" I said no before I could soften it. Then I surprised myself by adding, "But I think I need to." She nodded, not approving or disapproving, just understanding. "Then you will not go alone." That was how I arrived at my parents' house the following Sunday, with an attorney beside me and a folder under my arm. My mother opened the door with red eyes. My father looked past me at Audra and said, "This is family business." Audra smiled politely. Financial exploitation usually feels that way to the people benefiting from it. No one spoke for a moment. Inside, the living room had been arranged, like a small courtroom, pretending to be a prayer circle. Nolan sat on the sofa with his arms crossed. Patrice Varnell perched near the window, holding a leather planner like it could make her innocent. Ruth Ann was in the rocking chair, looking uncomfortable but present. My mother had even set out coffee and pound cake, as if hospitality could cover what we were really there to discuss. Dad started before I sat down. "Maren has forgotten what family means." His voice had that public weight he used when other people were listening. "Your mother and I made mistakes, but humiliating us, cutting things off, sending lawyers, that is not how decent children behave." Mom lowered her eyes and dabbed a tissue under them. Nolan muttered, "Exactly." Patrice added softly, "Sometimes adult children need to remember parents deserve care too." I waited until they were done using the word family like a locked door. Then, I opened the folder. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a speech. I placed the first page on the coffee table. Tessa's spreadsheet. $48,600 across 18 months. Then the Hilton Head itinerary. Then the credit card screenshots. Then the utility drafts. Then the vehicle paperwork. Then the email from Patrice confirming she had used the daughter's card on file. Paper makes a different sound when a room understands it. Each page landed softly, but everyone flinched. Audra leaned forward. "Before anyone uses the word family again," she said, "we should define who has been paying for it." My father's face darkened. My mother stopped crying. Nolan looked at the vehicle paperwork longer than anything else. Patrice reached for her planner, then seemed to remember there was nowhere to write herself out of this. Ruth Ann looked at me with something close to grief. For the first time in my life, my parents' living room was quiet, without me rushing to fix it. My mother was the first one to reach for a page, not the total, not the resort charge. She picked up the email from Patrice and read it with her lips pressed together. I watched her eyes move across the line Audra had highlighted. As long as Maren keeps the card active, we can spread the remaining balance over 3 months. My mother set it down carefully, as if the paper had burned her. That was not what it sounds like, she whispered. For once, no one helped her finish the sentence. I looked at Patrice. She had gone pale beneath her careful makeup. 3 months? I asked. There was a remaining balance? Patrice opened her planner, closed it, then looked at my mother instead of me. That told me enough. Audra slid another printed email onto the table. This one mentioned a fall cruise, a balcony cabin, and the phrase, same payment arrangement, if your daughter remains comfortable. My mother's face changed. Not with guilt. With the panic of someone realizing a private conversation had become evidence. Dad stood so quickly the coffee table shook. This is ridiculous. People plan things. That doesn't mean anything. His voice filled the room, but for the first time it did not fill me. You told me you needed help with the mortgage, I said. You told me Mom's prescriptions were getting expensive. You told me Nolan was almost on his feet. Nolan looked away. I turned toward him. Did you know? He rolled his eyes, but there was no confidence in it. Mom said you always calm down after a week. There it was. Not confusion. Not desperation. A system. They knew I would be upset. They knew I might cry, might stop answering for a few days, might say I was done. But they had counted on the same thing they had always counted on. That guilt would bring me back before the next bill was due. I felt something inside me go very still. It was not anger exactly. Anger moves. This was colder than that. This was recognition. My father pointed at the papers, like they were the ones betraying him. We are your parents. I nodded slowly. Yes, I said. That is why it took me this long to admit what you were doing. My mother began crying again, but the sound no longer pulled me across the room. Ruth Ann stood from the rocking chair, her face tight with disappointment. Celeste, she said quietly, you told me your daughter had turned cruel. You left out the part where she had been carrying you. Patrice tried to leave after that. Audra stopped her with one calm sentence. Miss Varnell, my office will be sending a formal notice regarding the disputed transaction and your communications with Mrs. Holloway. Patrice's hand froze on her planner. For the first time since I had met her, she had nothing polished to say. My father muttered something about outsiders ruining families. I almost smiled then, not because it was funny, but because I finally understood. Outsiders had not ruined my family. They had simply asked for receipts. I gathered the papers back into the folder one by one. No one apologized. No one asked how I had managed all those months. No one asked what I had given up, so they could keep pretending. But I did not need them to ask anymore. The proof was on the table. The silence was in the room. And for once, I was not the one buried under it. I left my parents' house that Sunday with the folder under my arm and no dramatic final speech behind me. The porch light was already on, though the sky had not gone fully dark. Ruth Ann walked me to my car, moving slowly down the steps with one hand on the railing I had fixed the year before. You did right, she said. I wanted to believe her immediately. Instead, I nodded, because sometimes freedom arrives before the guilt knows it is allowed to leave. The next few months were not clean or easy. My parents did not suddenly understand. Dad took a part-time job at an auto parts store and told relatives he had been forced out of retirement by an ungrateful daughter. Mom picked up extra hours at the dental clinic and stopped leaving tearful voicemails after Audra sent one formal letter. Nolan lost the Highlander and eventually took evening shifts at a warehouse outside town. Patrice's agency reviewed the booking, and her name disappeared from my mother's church stories almost overnight. As for me, I moved into a one-bedroom apartment 10 minutes from the rehab center. It was small, with old cabinets and a bedroom window that stuck when it rained, but every bill that came there belonged to me. The first month, I paid rent, electricity, and groceries, then stared at my bank balance waiting for the familiar panic. It never came. There was less money than I wanted, but for the first time in years, None of it was leaking into someone else's lie. Ellis wrote my recommendation for the RN Bridge program. Tessa helped me build a budget that included savings, car maintenance, and one Saturday breakfast a month that did not have to be justified to anyone. Ruth Ann brought me a small rosemary plant in a clay pot and set it on my windowsill. "For a home that finally belongs to you," she said. I cried after she left, not from sadness exactly, but from the strange tenderness of being seen without being needed. One Sunday evening, my mother called. I watched her name glow on the screen until the third ring. Then I answered. Her voice was careful. "I miss you," she said. For a second, I heard the mother I had spent my whole life trying to reach. "I miss you too," I told her. Then I took a breath. "But I'm not paying your bills anymore." The silence that followed was long. She cried softly. And this time, I did not rush to rescue either of us from it. I did not abandon my family. I returned their responsibilities to them. There is a difference. Though people who benefit from your exhaustion will pretend not to know it. Looking back, I do not remember the Hilton Head charge as the moment my family broke. I remember it as the moment the truth finally became visible. For the first time in years, silence did not feel like punishment. It felt like peace. Sometimes the hardest boundary to set is not with a stranger, an enemy, or someone who openly wants to hurt you. Sometimes the hardest boundary is with the people you love, the people who raised you, the people whose approval you spent your whole life trying to earn. Maren's story is not really about the real story is about what happens when love becomes confused with obligation, when family becomes a word people use to silence the person carrying the heaviest load. A good daughter should not have to disappear to prove she is grateful. A loving son should not have to sacrifice his future to be called loyal. A family should not require one person to stay exhausted so everyone else can stay comfortable. There is a quiet kind of damage that happens when you are always the responsible one. People stop asking whether you are tired. They stop wondering what you had to give up. They only notice when you finally stop giving. And when that day comes, they may call you selfish, cold, disrespectful, or cruel. But sometimes what they call cruelty is simply the first honest act of self-respect you have made in years. Forgiveness does not mean funding the same pain again. Love does not mean removing consequences. And peace does not always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives in a small apartment, a paid bill with only your name on it, a silent phone, and the realization that you are no longer living as someone else's emergency plan. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be this. Helping your family is beautiful when it comes from love, but it becomes dangerous when it costs you your dignity, your health, and your future. You are allowed to care without being consumed. You are allowed to say no, and still have a heart. If Maren's story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to set a boundary with someone you loved? And if you enjoy stories about family, resilience, truth, and rebuilding your life, please subscribe and join us for the next one.